pleasure. Thank you so much. It's lovely to see everybody online. For those people who don't know the Good Governance Academy, Professor Mervyn King actually founded the Good Governance Academy in 2019. We provide thought leadership around critical business issues as a public good. And we host webinars and 2 colloquia a year. And our 2 colloquia are summarized in memoranda, which are sent out and distributed to our support members. We also have endorsed training programs, and we have book reviews. So we bring authors in to discuss their books. And this is one of our book reviews, is with Professor Mervyn King and the author, David Williams. But I'm very happy to introduce you to the chairman of the chair of the Good Governance Academy, Alan Johnson. So Alan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are in the world. Today is really a very special day, one which is to honor and recognize the significant contribution that my dear friend, Professor Mervyn King, has made right across the world over 4 decades. Mervyn, you have really been an ardent, protagonist and campaigner for everything in terms of high quality, effective governance, high quality reporting, right across the world. I mean, you of course, you're a lawyer by background, but actually, for me, you're an ardent businessman. You understand business. You understand what good business looks like. You understand what good governance should be, and you've campaigned for that over many years. You led the Eminent Persons Group of the United Nations for Governance and Oversight. You initiated the Global Reporting Initiative. You founded the International Integrated Reporting Council, and of course the same council for South Africa. And of course, and you're well known for leading the corporate governance reviews in South Africa, known as the King Code, and I think it's got up to King 4, King 5. Mervyn, you've created fantastic links across institutions, across academia, professional bodies, amongst others. And you really have helped all of us understand that to be successful in business also means being responsible to your consumers, to your customers, to your suppliers, to your partners, and to do everything to make sure that business is done in a way that addresses the needs of all. And the thing that I remarked over many, many years and made me think when I was active as an executive in business is that it's not the primacy of the shareholder that governs what businesses should do, but it's actually the primacy of all stakeholders. And one thing that I learned from you was that if you look after all of your stakeholders, by definition, you'll be doing the right thing for shareholders. So for me, corporate governance starts by doing the right thing for all stakeholders, and doing that means that you will, of course, address the needs, the long-term needs of all of your shareholders at the same time. So Mervyn, you've infected me with your passion, with your energy, with your commitment, with your drive. And of course, a few years ago, you invited me, to join the Good Governance Academy, which I had no doubt was the right place for me to spend some of my time. And a couple of years ago, you then asked me in Johannesburg, when we met over lunch, to take over the chair. That was probably one of the biggest honors that I was bestowed by anyone in my sort of career. So Mervyn, thank you so much for everything you've done. David has written a wonderful book which captures your life and all the great things that you have done and your contributions that you've made over, as I said, over 4 decades. So it's an honor really to have got to know you back in 2006 in London, and to have looked at what you've done, benefited from the great work you've done, and then of course in the last few years being closely associated with you. Mervyn, thank you so much. This is your day, and I hope you enjoy it because you deserve it. David.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Alan. And before I move on, I want to thank Alan for writing the preface to the book. He did it very quickly too, and it was so enthusiastic. Normally, prefaces to books tend to be quite somber and dry, and academic, but Alan's one is it has weight and it's lively and energetic, and I think it just is a tribute to Mervyn that Alan feels like this and he's able to express it as well. So thank you for that. It struck me that what I say at the beginning of the book is that for any man or woman to achieve the top in one field, such as law, maybe becoming a judge or the Chief Justice, or in business to become a chief executive or chairman of a big company or a big conglomerate, or to become a governance guru, someone who works their way through the ranks of company secretaries and directors and becomes an expert on governance. Most people would be delighted to reach the top in any one of these fields. And of course, what struck me at the beginning about Mervyn is he reached the top in all three. Not only that, the first two, law and business, prepared him, of course, for the governance process. And I wonder if there's anyone else in the world who's had a comparable experience to equip them to get into the governance field. Because he was an advocate, so good at putting a case, a Supreme Court, High Court judge, able to make decisions on complex issues, a businessman, a turnaround artist, fast-moving consumer goods, big companies, learning how to work with people, learning how to work in a society at that time, really almost destroyed by apartheid. But what I discovered when Mervyn and I started talking was that nearly wasn't so. There was a fourth career that he may well have gone into. Mervyn, tell us how you nearly didn't become a lawyer, a businessman, and a governance guru.
Thank you, David. Well, to do a law degree in South Africa, it's a postgraduate degree, and you have to have a degree to do the law degree. And I chose to do a Bachelor of Arts degree, and one of my majors was music. And I did very well in my 3 years of music study, and the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Music said to me, he knows that I did this as a stepping stone to do my LLB, my law degree, but he really thinks that my career lies in music. And I was very young because I finished school at the age of 15, just going on to 16. And at the age of 18, 19, I was already lecturing at Wits University. And he said to me, I think you should do an honors degree in music. And I was young and flattered. And I said, well, okay. And I did a thesis on the development of organ music on the Witwatersrand, the Whitewater Ridge, where gold was discovered in Johannesburg. And a very interesting organ that had been played for Jannie Smuts, one of our great prime ministers, Paul Kruger, going back in all the history of the Anglo-Boer War, etc., etc. And I'd actually finished the thesis, photographs, the console, etc., of the organ. And I'd spent 8-9 months doing it, and I suddenly thought, what am I doing here? I've always wanted to be a barrister. And so I just left the faculty and said, I'm not handing in my thesis. And I went to look for articles and to find articles and to study at night my law degree. And so that's how I nearly landed up being in music, David, but I decided not to be.
Yeah, so music's loss was interesting to speculate where you would have got to eventually. I'm sure somewhere near the top, whatever that is in the music field. But yeah, you went into the law, and as I said, became an advocate and a judge, and then went into business. Governance, it's an interesting one because you've regarded governance and the King Codes and all the issues around that and global governance issues as the core of what you'd like to see as your achievement. And yet you never had a thought of doing that when you went into it. So I think it's worth letting people know before we go on to some of the concepts that we cover in the book, how you got into the governance world. You were a very successful businessman. You'd been a very successful lawyer and judge, and then you got a request from the Institute of Directors in South Africa.
Yes, it was 1992, and we knew we were going into our democracy by 1994. So we were moving from a country of unequal opportunity to one of equal opportunity. And obviously, my fellow citizens who had been precluded effectively from the corporate world were now going to come into the corporate world, participate in the running of companies. And some guidance was needed. At that time, Adrian Cadbury in the United Kingdom had written the first code in the world on governance. In other words, to take the UK Companies Act and make it alive, because what the code does it starts bringing to life what you read in the Companies Act. It shows you how to conduct yourself, how to be a good director, etc. And Adrian Cadbury had the force of law behind him because it was asked by the Financial Reporting Council in England. And his remit was the financial aspects of corporate governance. And that was indicative of the regime in which companies operated then, namely the primacy of the shareholder. And that stemmed from the incorrect thinking right through the 20th century that the shareholders were the owners of the company. Well, the company is a legal fiction, and one can't touch it. It's intangible, but it's probably the most important citizen in every country in the world, the limited liability company, because it's a platform for raising capital and also for creating jobs for people. And that's why the UK government in the middle of the 19th century passed the first act of parliament to create this artificial person, the company. So the IRD phoned me and asked me, because of my background as a corporate lawyer and having been chair and chief executive of companies in England, listed in London, Europe, and South Africa. So they knew my background and believed I was the right person to sit down and write a code for the new South Africa. So I was phoned by the chief executive of the IRD and asked, would I do that? And at the time I was the chair of the biggest textile company in the Southern Hemisphere. And also I was chairman of First National Corporate and Merchant Bank and of the Retail Bank. And we had broken away the Merchant and Corporate Bank because we knew that the merchant banks of the world would start arriving in South Africa once we had become a democracy. And we wanted to break away from the Retail Bank. And I was asked to chair that and do all that. And serendipity, that afternoon, Mr. Mandela phoned me. Now, he and I had known each other before he went to jail. And while he was in jail, I chaired the organization known as Operation Hunger, where we fed about 1.5 million children in the so-called homelands, part of the apartheid policy, to Zulu people to go back to Zululand, Venda to Venda, and so on. But when journalists came from the UK or wherever they came to the cities, but the real hardship was in the rural areas. And because there was no infrastructure in those rural areas. And there was a question of hunger. And Operation Hunger was founded, and they ran into trouble. And that's when they asked me to come chair it and try and get it out of trouble. At the time, I was the chairman of two great retail companies, Metro Cash and Carry and Checkers, in the retail food business. So I had access to the great food producers in South Africa. And I used that buying power, not personally buying power, but the companies of which I was the chair, for those organizations to make up a nutritional package which cost 34 cents. And for 17 years, we fed about 1.5 million children a day. And Mr. Mandela's daughter, Zinzi, worked with me, for me, at there. She died 2 years ago, unfortunately. But through her, Mr. Mandela and I kept in touch even while he was in jail. But that afternoon, he phoned me to speak to me about, he was concerned and he had precedence in that regard, because we still have problems in our education system in South Africa. To speak to me about that. And so at the end of that conversation, I said to him, by the way, Mr. Mandela, just been asked to, by the IRD, would I form a committee to write a code for, corporate code for, on governance, on how we should run companies in the new South Africa. And his words to me were, do it, you're the right man. Just make sure nobody charges any money for it. They do it with their hand and their heart in the interest of South Africa. And that's, to me, was a command. And I phoned back the IRD and said, all right, I'll do it. And I did. I formed a committee which was reflective of what Bishop Tutu called our Rainbow Nation. I had, for example, Richard Mponya, which I think, David, you may remember, Mr. Mponya, built Mponya Mall in Soweto. And I had, and I still have, a dining suite, which is Victorian, have an antique. And Richard was a big man, and he came for dinner one night, and I can still, we were talking, and we said there's something that was going to laugh, and he leaned back, and he broke the back off one of my antique chairs. But we formed this committee, and one thing I knew, David, that if I had to create a code, so people talk about genius on my part in changing the thinking, but it were the circumstances that drove me to actually direct and steer my committee away from the dictum of the primacy of the shareholder, because we'd come out with that capital being mainly in the hands of the white community in South Africa. It would have been seen in the later Bell Pottinger language as white monopolistic capital. And it would have not been accepted, it would have been a failure. So we came out with what was really new thinking, that you should learn as a board, as a collective mind, the needs, interests, and expectations of your major stakeholders. So you're informed about that in making a business judgment call. But always make that business judgment call in the best long-term interests of the health of the company, this incapacitated, important citizen in the country that has no heart, mind, or conscience. You as the director of the heart, mind, and conscience of that company. And if you make that decision in the best long-term interest of the health of the company, eventually it's for the best interest of all the stakeholders in the company. So that's effectively what came out, and then it assumed my name as the chair, as the King report, and that became King 1. And as Alan has said, I became chair of the Eminent Persons Group of the United Nations, where I really started learning about sustainability. And in 2002, we recommended and wrote King 2, as it became known. Well, it was our second report, so it became known as King 2. And we recommended sustainability reporting, so the JSE adopted it. So we were the first country in the world to do sustainability reporting. So sorry, a long answer to your question.
No, we want long answers, Mervyn. There's a lot to tell. And what struck me too in talking to Mervyn and writing about it, there's so much. And of course, part of the job of a journalist, which I also am, is to select information. It wasn't easy, but a couple of people have said to me, where did you get the title from? Corporate Revolutionary. And I suppose, first of all, we had to have a working title. So the working title, as we spoke about the book and talked to the publishers, was Mervyn King's Life in Business, Law and Governance. And I thought, this isn't really significant enough a title to do justice to the man, or I hope the book. And when you think about, to say that Mervyn King has made a contribution to governance, to those of you who know cricket, it would be like saying Donald Bradman has made a contribution to batting, or Herbert van Karajan has made a contribution to conducting. These are big significant things. And I thought there are revolutions that have happened, and the number, just talk a little bit about two or three aspects of that title. Number one, in South Africa, we actually feared a real revolution with violence and thousands of people killed, a civil war. If you were in South Africa in the 1980s, that was the great fear, and no one could see the way out of the 1980s apartheid. Everyone knew apartheid couldn't be sustained, but no one knew how to get out of it. And thanks to the appearance at the same time of Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk, who was by no means an ally of Mandela, but he saw the need and he took the step, which no one expected, of setting him free without conditions, and that set things on the move. But as Mervyn says, the corporate environment remained a creature of the past 300 years of racist and then formal apartheid practice. And what the codes did was to revolutionize those in power in business, which was mostly aging white men. It encouraged, forced, cajoled, pushed them to take a different view on how companies should be run for the good of the society. And I think without business doing that, the pressures that would have built up from workers, from trade unions, from politicians on business may well have made a democratic transition unstable and maybe unsustainable. That was the first revolutionary impact, I believe, which no one expected or had thought about. It was the political dimension, the military dimension that people were worried about. The second relates to Mervyn's talking about the primacy of the shareholder, this concept that a company is there to make money for the shareholder. And this was, and it still holds in some companies, this ruled for well over a century until Mervyn questioned it and said, that's not how you can run the governance. That was revolutionary. And another aspect, there could be more, is people throughout the King Code publications have said, yes, but they haven't got teeth. They haven't got teeth. It needs to have the force of law. And Mervyn, perhaps surprisingly as a lawyer, said, no, that's not the way to go. You need legislation, perhaps in some ways, to back it, but you need peer pressure, you need values, you need ethics. And I think to go the route of not resorting to the law and ultimately litigation about whether you're compliant, that was revolutionary. It was saying our problems are not all to be solved by going to the courts. So there are several aspects, and I think there may be others as well. And we came up with the corporate revolutionary, which I think is catchy and it's accurate for what has been achieved. In South Africa at that time, when King 1 came out, directors were appalled to see Mervyn's and his committee's recommendation. They must reveal their collective remuneration. They can't do this. They'll kidnap our children. The competition will get crucial information and so on. Now it's accepted. Not only do they give collective remuneration reports, they have to give individual remuneration reports. Things that seemed outrageous and revolutionary at the time, in South Africa, for example, have become part of the furniture. And as Mervyn has said, it moved beyond from how companies' directors behave to how companies should behave, and directors make sure that they get there. So I thought it worth saying, why revolutionary? Because governance to some seems a dry box ticking exercise. I've understood that it emphatically is not. Maybe talk a bit more there, Mervyn, about why you took this view, and you took it from the beginning. Like many of the positions you took, you remained consistent in principle through. Why not make it all enforceable by law? Why go the voluntary compliance route? What was your thinking?
Well, my thinking is to move. Directors need to have an open mind and original intellectual thought. And as soon as you legislate for something, you get mindless box ticking, and it becomes a grudge compliance. So Alan, being in business, will, I think, agree with what I'm about to say, that actually the governance codes in countries around the world started becoming grudge compliance issues. And they had also become mindless box ticking exercises. And what I was trying to do was to make them mindful. And you can't do that by saying you have to do it in a certain manner. And for example, in South Africa, the government in about 2002 passed the Public Finance Management Act for our state-owned companies, that they must do the X in this way and that way, and even changed the language. Chief Executive Officer became known as the accounting officer. So you can see the focus on finance. And fascinating that there were many breaches of the PFMA. There was state capture in South Africa, a phenomenon that our then president, actually connived with a family called the Gupta family and captured some of our biggest state-owned companies. And yet those companies were releasing reports saying, yes, we have an audit committee, yes, we have a nominations committee, etc., etc. And there was a compliance. But was there this mindfulness that you actually apply your mind to make a judgment call on the best long-term interests of the health of the company? And that takes mindfulness and this mindless compliance. And as soon as one legislates, David, it does become mindless. Because we've seen in the PFMA that there's a draconian provision that if you don't comply, with that certain provision, it's 10 years imprisonment. So it's a conformist mindset that comes to work in the morning. And I've been consulted by several of these large state-owned companies, and I'm told they spend about 60% of their time on conformance instead of performance. And that's not what we want. We want this honest application of mind, an appreciation as a director that you're the heart, mind, and conscience of the company. So when something goes wrong, the wrath of society shouldn't turn against the company, but rather against its directors, because they are the heart, mind, and soul, not the company. And conscience is a critical issue. And so all these things, to me, I believed that to move away from legislation, you must do it with a sanction, rather peer pressure, and being seen to be a good corporate citizen by your stakeholders, particularly your customer and the suppliers, etc., supplying you on credit, was the way to go. And it's been, I think, proven over the years that the great companies in the world, let's just take our own great company, the Anglo-American company, they were built on a basis of integrity. And they haven't needed an act of parliament such as the Public Finance Management Act. And they're not a state-owned company, they're a private sector company. And yet, have you ever heard of a scandal or a shadow over the Anglo-American group? No. And yet they are still, I don't know how old it is, Dave, I think it must be about 100 years old now, Anglo.
Yeah, 107 years old.
Yeah, 107 years old. Well, there you are. And they've done it without legislation telling them what to do. They've done it as good directors in the best long-term interest of the health of the company.
Yeah, so, and linked to that, another insight of Mervyn's, which I think could also be called revolutionary in the way responsibility within a company is allocated for making sure the right things happen. Now, I was in the fortunate position as a journalist of covering Mervyn, as the term goes, in many of his activities, writing about the companies or being certainly aware of them as a journalist when someone else was writing about them, which helped me because I knew what he was talking about when he talked about the 80s and 90s events. But when I worked at SA Breweries, I was on the other side of the fence. South African Breweries, one of the great South African companies, which is now part of an international conglomerate brewing company. Excellent company. I worked there for 5 years. And they were very good at the sustainability aspects and on reporting on sustainability, such as a big brewery, their aim was to achieve water neutrality. So somehow they put back into the resource of the country the equivalent of the water that they use for their beer, which is quite some feat, consisting that beer is mostly water, and they produce millions of liters a year. They were very concerned with things like that. However, it was a separate department. It fell under the public affairs department, not under the accountants or the finances, not under the brewing or the manufacturing or the distribution. It was a separate department. So the company said they were taking it seriously. And I think a simple insight by Mervyn is that if you make the accountants responsible, then you are saying this is of the same importance as the financial report. The financial report is very important, but it's only one of the aspects. And I think, Mervyn, you used the phrase accountants, it's accountants who will save the world, which seems counterintuitive when you first think of it, because you think of them as bean counters. But of course, you're expecting them now to be much more than that.
Yes. Alan will remember, I think it was in about 2006, and eventually I wrote the book in 2016, Chief Value Officer. And IFAC, in fact, agreed with me. I think it was, at the time, it was Olivia Kirtley was the president. And IFAC wrote an article agreeing with me that, in fact, no accountant with her salts by this time, which was about 2008, about 2009, somewhere around there, sits in a corner office and drafts the financial statements according to the IASB or the FASB, depending on your jurisdiction standards. They actually are starting to think about this value creation process. So they've moved away from the primacy of the shareholder and success being dictated by increased profit, increased dividend, increased share price. And really the question was now being asked, how has the company made its money? Because if it's made its money responsibly, it is adding value to society. Otherwise, it's not adding value to society. And really this legal fiction of a company was created in the middle of the 19th century by society for society. The UK government was the representative of society. And so companies need to be seen to act as responsible corporate citizens and be creating value for society. And I believe that at the junction, business was at the junction of the economy, society, and the environment, and that you could not believe and or see business operating in an economic bubble. It was actually cockeyed thinking when you think about right through the 20th century, and in the 1970s exacerbated by Milton Friedman, who wrote the famous article in the New York Times saying, the sole purpose of the limited liability company is to make profit for the shareholders. And so he exacerbated the situation. for which he got a Nobel Prize. And actually, the profit companies, when one looks back with the wisdom of hindsight, was being subsidized by society and the environment. I mean, we were all responsible during the 20th century of degrading planet Earth. But the biggest degrader was the limited liability company, just by the nature of things. And so, you know, you talk about creating value, but companies were not really creating value. And the idea was you increase the wealth of shareholders at the top, and that wealth would trickle down to the impoverished at the bottom. Well, I've said this many times, the trickle became treacle, and it stuck at the top because the wealthy at the top increased that wealth. They didn't, as it was believed, would invest in another business and create more jobs, and etc. No. Most of them bought another yacht or bought another villa in the south of France or whatever it was. And it didn't trickle down to create more business. It became treacle and stuck at the top. So the concept of the primacy of the shareholder was something that actually caused a lot of harm to planet Earth. And I said that the accountant can't save the planet. Now, why? Because the accountant has a public interest training. And the accountant started having an appreciation of the fact, if you look at accounting for sustainability, the Prince's Trust in the UK, Prince Charles, now King Charles, had an appreciation that we had to start changing how we did our financial statements to incorporate the impact that companies were having on the three pillars for sustainable development: the economy, society, and the environment. And then subsequently, after Lehman Brothers and the GFC, we saw that the economy, society, and the environment have an impact in turn on the company. So like a coin that's got these two sides. And so companies, the whole mindset of boards started changing. That's the true, you know, it's the essence of what we've called a revolution. That the mindset of boards, when Alan and I sat on boards at the beginning, we never had the mindset we have today. That we make sure we review our business model to see it through the three prisms of the economy, society, and the environment. Whereas we used to just look at the economic outcomes. Now we look at what are the outcomes, the impacts on society and the environment. And if we get that right, we're adding true value to society and to the planet. And if we, the directors of companies, limited liability companies around the world, don't get it right, then I can tell you there may not be a planet by the end of the century. That's just the reality. Because empirical evidence showed, research by the beginning of the 21st century, that we, as Homo sapiens, which had the awesome responsibility of actually looking after planet Earth, being the top of the creature chain, hadn't done so with the primacy of the shareholder model. And always at the back of my mind, David, and my thinking was that business actually has to save the planet, because we were still using natural assets faster than nature was regenerating. So that is still happening, and we've got population increasing, so demand for product increases. And the only thing that's going to help us is technology. And technology may well get us out of it. So that was the driving of my thinking.
And to integrate all of it, and you will talk in a moment about the integrated report, which drives behavior, as opposed to it being the other way around. But for those who resisted what Mervyn's saying, we have one graph in the book. and it's a graph which shows the financial component of a company's value. Talk a little bit about that graph, Mervyn, because if anyone thinks you're just talking about sweetness and light and being idealistic, the facts actually show how important it is that we don't just worry about the money we make.
Yes, that research started from the 1970s, and the research showed by the 1980s that the financial statements we were issuing as directors on behalf of the company were critical, but not sufficient to discharge our duty of accountability. That after the turn of the 21st century, we started that initiative known as, and it was called the initiative, the Global Reporting Initiative, which was guidelines to try and report on this value, which research showed that 80% of the makeup of the market cap of companies on the S&P 500, for example, was made up of matters which were not edited in a balance sheet according to financial reporting standards. And these were known as the non-financial aspects and sustainability aspects and the ESG aspects, etc., etc. But they were critical and started changing the minds of investors, because to look at a company that was still carrying on business on a basis, taking its output, such as waste, and charging it into a river, creating another dead zone in the ocean. We've got 7 dead zones as I'm speaking to you, where fish can no longer live. And well, if you carry on like that, you're not going to have a planet. And the United Nations recognized that and issued in 2015 the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And today, when directors review their business models, they look to see what SDG can incorporate in that business model to try and make sure that they can have a sustainable business for those who come after us. And I think we have a moral duty to try and leave the planet in, at least in the state we found it when we arrived on this planet. But unfortunately, we didn't do that. And we didn't do that because of the dictate of the primacy of the shareholder and the thinking that success was increased profit, increased share price, increased dividend, but without realizing that it was being subsidized by society, for example, child labor to reduce expenditure and degrading the planet with putting waste directly into a river, for example, or whatever it was. But today, people are aware of how has the company made its money. And today, if a company loses the trust and confidence of the community in which it operates, that company will fail.
Mervyn, it sounds good. You've had 4 iterations of the King codes. Each one has taken things further. Thinking has been changed in many respects in corporates and in entities around the world, but the battle isn't won, is it? And at the end of the book, you suggested, in fact, you insisted that we put in the infinity sign. And you said too that Adrian Cadbury had said to you that you had done the right thing by continuing the King Committee. In other words, governance is a process. It's not an event where you publish codes and that's that. It's a continuing process and dynamic. There are still difficulties, aren't there, with this approach? And within the global reporting professional network, there are disagreements or perhaps in innocence, blind alleys being taken. It's by no means achieved what you see as being necessary.
Yes. It's one of the reasons why 6 years ago I started the Good Governance Academy, because I realized being spoken at business schools and universities and large corporations around the world have been, that there were still people clinging to the primacy of the shareholder model. And I thought I'll use my network and start actually getting speakers who understand this change of approach to how companies should be conducted, their businesses out there. So I married SDG 4, which is quality education, with SDG 17 collaboration. And I've got 181 universities, business schools, societies of accountants, etc., to be our support members. And Carolyn is the chief executive, and she will send, Ellen is the chairman of the company, and we will send out an invitation for our last colloquium was on the doctrine of equivalence in sustainability reporting. And it went to 181 members, and through that they send it to their members. And this understanding of how business science issues has changed, and how the collective mind of boards is no longer just about increasing profit at any cost, but actually adding value to society and making sure we don't further degrade planet Earth. Went to 4.5 million accountants, other professionals and companies in 137 countries. And I think it's achieved the purpose, and it certainly is educative around the world. And people are understanding, and I think I can say that I don't believe there's any organization in the world today, so that includes organizations other than limited liability companies, that still thinks in silos. They think in this integrated manner. And so I think that Bastille has been stormed. And the IFRS is now the owner of the IR framework, the integrated reporting framework. And they've taken pieces out of the framework and put it into their general requirements, their standard S1 of the ISSB, of the International Sustainability Standards Board, under the IFRS. And then in their expanded management commentary, which is still to go out for consultation, they've taken things out of the general requirements and content elements of the IR framework and put it in that expanded management commentary. Now, I'm concerned about that, which I've expressed to the IFRS, that it's a foreign concept for management to be reporting to one stakeholder, the investor. I mean, it's the board's duty to report to the company, through the company, to all the stakeholders. But to get management to actually report on issues to the investor. And first of all, it concerns me that if a regulator anywhere in the world makes that mandatory, if I am a manager of a company, I've got a written contract of employment setting up my duties and responsibility, and a company suddenly says to me, well, we've adopted this management commentary now, and we're going to do it. And you, Mervyn, and you, John, and you, David, you, Alan, you chaps are going to now do this management commentary. You're adding to my duties and responsibilities. Now, legally speaking, that's a breach of contract. I can cancel that contract and sue you for damages. So I've said to the IFRS, you've opened a Pandora's box here of litigation, and you've also introduced a foreign thinking that management that is an employee and must report to, owes its duty to the employer, and if it reports to anybody, it's going to be reporting to the board, but not to an outside stakeholder. And that's a complete foreign concept which cuts across the responsibilities of the board, which is to be accountable for what happens inside the company. And I'm just concerned that that's going to open a Pandora's box of litigation and all that, but they're still thinking about it.
Well,
And it
Mervyn,
seems
I mean, just to stop you there for a moment, isn't it showing the tenacity of the shareholder primacy model? They defaulting back. You've got to report to the shareholders, which in a sense is the old model, isn't it?
The interesting thing, David, is that the investor is defined by the IFRS as the person who usually reads the financial statements. Now, the provider of goods and services on credit is actually a provider of capital to the company. But the interesting thing is the majority of shareholders are not providers of capital. Now, that sounds like an extraordinary statement, but I'll show it to you. You've got a successful business. We have the five of us. We decide we're going to list on the London Stock Exchange. We do an initial public offering where we're going to raise £100 million. And we find subscribers, and we oversubscribed. We've got £100 million, and we've got now, let's say, 10,000 shareholders. That subscription money goes into the bank account of the company. But after 9 months of trading, the share price actually goes up by 25%. Alan and Carolyn think, well, actually, we've made a good investment here. I think we should sell our shares. And they sell it to John and Peter. Who did John and Peter pay for their shares? They pay Carolyn and Alan. The money doesn't go into the company. Now, the majority, that's secondary market shareholders. The majority of shareholders on the great stock exchanges in the world are secondary market shareholders. They're not the original subscribers. If during the period of the life of the company there's a rights issue and they elect to follow those rights, of course they become a provider of capital again. But ordinarily speaking, after that subscription and the sale into secondary markets, the shareholder who has no duty or responsibility to the company has not provided 1 cent of capital to the company. He or she or it is a share trader today and is concerned, of course, how the company performs, etc. But that's out of selfish self-interest. They're not concerned about the company, and they're concerned about just what happens to the bottom line. So you have people in the US, in the main, saying, this thing of ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues, is a fad. Well, some fad that right through the 20th century, we succeeded in degrading planet Earth. We actually took from society. I remember when I was in practice as a lawyer, there was a large dress manufacturing company, and they were spread out on the floor of a huge building, and the employees clocked in the morning, and they made sure they didn't go out, they locked all the doors. Now, when you've got cotton fabric, the dust rises into the ceiling, and if somehow the wind gets in and they start rubbing against each other, it actually becomes inflammable. And there was a fire, and the people couldn't get out of the doors. I can tell you a long story what happened with that litigation, but it just shows you how the question of how society has been treated by the limited liability company has not been in their interest. And I think one thing COVID proved to us, that we need to have proper health situations in companies that we operate in, if we're going to be responsible corporate directors with a conscience.
Mervyn, I'm not sure if Carolyn wants us to wrap up a minute or two early. We're about 5 minutes away from the end of the hour. But I might just say, Carolyn, I just wanted to say in South Africa, what struck me is how all of this applies to the state-owned entities. The government talks of itself as the shareholder of these big entities like Transnet, the railway network, and Eskom, the big electricity utility. Now, these big companies, which they are companies under law, have been nearly destroyed by corruption. And the governance test can be applied to them, very bad governance. But we also talk about business failures and how in South Africa and globally, like Lehman Brothers and Arthur Andersen, you can trace back the corporate failure not to incompetence or criminality, although there may well have been that, but to a failure on the part of the directors of the company to ensure that the company was being run right. So we talk about it where things go wrong, which backs up the argument of how things should be run so that they go right. Carolyn, do you want to, I'm not sure how you want to wrap this up?
No, I'm very happy to wrap up, but does Prof. King, would you like to say something to that?
Well, I think, David, you've hit a very sore point there, because in most of the legislation, the state, as major, or in most cases the sole shareholder, gives the right to the minister to appoint the chairman and the chief executive. Now, you start with bad governance, because good governance, the shareholders, the governance architecture is the shareholders appoint the directors. Then the directors among themselves appoint their leader, because the chairman is the leader of the board. He's not the leader of the company, he's the leader of the board. Then the board, as a collective mind, has its mind as to who could be the chief executive, has the qualities to be a chief executive and to really make this organization fulfill its purpose and be successful. And the state sees itself as the owner of these state-owned companies, and they're not the owners of the company. The state, in fact, is the shareholder, and who is the state? How should they act when they appoint directors? Not their friends, not their colleagues. They should be appointing directors who are skilled for that business and that interest. And if they don't do that, they're failing in their duty to the citizens of South Africa. And I'm afraid one of the reasons for the failure of a lot of our state-owned companies is this absolutely contrary to good governance, where the shareholder appoints the chairman and the chief executive. And look at the inequity of it. If the company fails, who gets sued? Certainly the chairman and the chief executive and the other directors. The minister doesn't get sued. So it's completely unreal. And also when a chairman sits in the boardroom and he sits with two pips on his shoulder, sole shareholder and leader of the board. Well, now you've got bias in your thinking when you start debating an issue and trying to come to a collective mind decision in the best long-term interest of the company. I've always said that if you're a director of a state-owned company and you're in the shower in the morning and your wife calls you and says, "Darling, the minister's on the phone," and you put a towel around yourself and you go to the phone and you say, "Morning, Mr. Minister. Good morning, Mervyn. The cabinet met yesterday, and we know you're having a board meeting today in this X company. We hope the outcome's going to be X, Y, Z." Now, the courageous, honest, thinking director that realizes he's the heart, mind, and conscience of the company, this is his response. "Well, thank you, Mr. Minister, for that input. I will certainly put it on the table for consideration by my fellow directors and myself, and use it as input to arrive at a decision in the best long-term interest of the company. Of course, Mr. Minister, you're not suggesting to me that has to be the outcome, and I shouldn't properly apply my mind to the issue, because I would be committing a fraud on the company and you would be complicit with me, and you would never do a thing like that, Mr. Minister. Have a nice day."
And with that,
it takes courage to be a good director.
and with that, I'd like to say, have a nice day to everybody online. Thank you for joining us. We are going to have another interview between Prof. King and David in September. Please join our mailing list of the Good Governance Academy, and we'll send you out notifications of the next event. And a very special thank you to Alan for joining us today. Thank you for making your time available to us.
Thank you.
And thank you to Mervyn and David. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Caroline.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Alan.
Bye.